In terms of what we're talking about today, the topic is kind of mental health in these crazy times. I'm going to shorten it to how I think there's some definition we probably need to do around kind of mental health and Islamic psychology, because that's possibly a new concept to a lot of people, even though the language of therapy and counselling is fairly commonplace now.
Right.
But Islamic psychology is completely different. So I wonder whether you could start with some kind of defining.
Yeah. So Islamic psychology is looking at, so it's really more about looking at the root of that word, psychology, right? So the study of the psyche, the study of the soul. And so in the Islamic part of that really defines the notion of the epistemological and ontological framework that we understand the soul, because that's how we understand sort of the self and human being. So it's somewhat separated out from, oftentimes in contemporary psychology, I think there's a conflation between psychology and psychiatry and sort of biological factors in perhaps chemical imbalance in the brain. And so, that all gets clumped together. Whereas, when there's physical body, biological things causing somebody's mental health experience or even mental illness or chemical imbalance, then that is obviously not involving ontology necessarily, or the way that we understand the self, because it's physical. But then when we get into notions of understanding and defining the self, really that is as about philosophy. And there has been a lot of removal of philosophy from the field of psychology to go more towards this hard science, when really it hasn't been. It wasn't when it started. And so then when we look at Islamic psychology or psychology, this notion of psychology from within the Islamic tradition, we are going way back. It's not a new thing. What's new is that we're talking about it in this language, right? So the term Islamic psychology is relatively new, although, there has been in Arabic, the word ilm nafs has been used. Now it's referred to the modern field of psychology, but there is a understanding of the soul, which is, this is knowledge directly from the Quran. The Quran and the Sunnah are replete with understandings of the self, the soul, who we are, how we work, and sort of a map for the human being. But it has traditionally been spread out amongst many different branches of knowledge within the Islamic tradition. So we're talking philosophy, kalam, fiqh, all these different branches of knowledge that deal with the human being. But there was never really a need to separate out psychology per se, because the Islamic approach in general is one that is integral and integrated and very holistic. Yeah. So that even when we think of the early scholars you look at their work and you can identify that they were psychologists, they were working on psychology, but they were polymaths, they were physicians and they were theologians. And there wasn't really a distinction. You wouldn't really approach the healing of the physical body without an integral understanding of the soul. Yeah. And that really comes from an Islamic perspective and approach based in sort of this holistic and integrative philosophy and ontology. So this is really what we are referring to in Islamic psychology. It's not necessarily the isolation of just mental activity or for that matter, the brain. That's, our contemporary notion of psychology. Even when you hear psychology mentioned or you see a talk on psychology, you often see a severed head with a brain, right? And maybe and some like activity happening in the brain, like neurons. And so, there's this notion of like neuropsychology, but then also there's this Cartesian notion of I think, therefore I am, where we're oriented to understanding the self as thoughts and this mental world. And so from an Islamic perspective of the self, it's understanding the whole being that includes cognition, the cognitive element, the heart, feelings, the body's role in that, and then the spiritual reality. So there's these concepts from like the nafs, the qalb, the ruh, the aql. These are how we understand the sort of anatomy of the soul. And I would say, just sort of closing that, or from that thought, that whereas a contemporary notion of psychology is really centers the identity of the human being in the mind, an Islamic perspective would definitely center it more in the heart.
Yeah, and that's actually a really big distinction. It kind of changes the whole way that you look at things, right? So,
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about how Islam for a lot of people has become very transactional. You know, we're taught it as children. You know, this is your alif ba ta, this is how you read your Quran, this is how you pray, these are the surahs that you learn by heart. And so you carry out these acts, and then you expect that things will be okay because you've carried out these acts. And there's this real disconnect, and I think you were calling it spiritual bypassing, where we bypass the bit where we have to involve the heart, you know, and the spirituality side of it. So is that something that you found as well?
Yeah, it's this orientation to the deen of Islam. Often people learn it as a religion and as a sort of something that's separate from our life, right? So it's this theological construct that maybe is confined to the mosque and belief. And then there's over here, there's like, well, I've got to get through my daily life, and I'm trying to understand how to live in the dunya. And there's this disconnect of bringing these things together to where, like you said, it becomes transactional. So if I do X, Y, and Z of what I'm supposed to do in the deen, I will be okay, or I will be saved, maybe.
Yeah, I'm doing enough if I do that,
Yeah, and you hear this oftentimes when people say, like, well, if you just have more iman, then things will be sorted out, right? So in reference to somebody struggling with life, having anxiety, having depression, which are natural reactions to being human in the world, the notion is that, well, if you just had more iman, you wouldn't be dealing with these issues. Or it can be, sorry.
I was just going to say, and actually that's a really, really damaging notion, because it prevents people coming forward because they think, well, actually, the fault is in me. My iman isn't strong, I'm not praying enough, I'm not doing the right du'as, I'm not doing the right prayers in the right way. The fault is in me. So it stops people coming forward and asking for help, actually, which is really damaging. And also, it can also then lead to them being quite, you know, turning against the religion almost. Well, look, I'm doing all this stuff, why am I not feeling better?
Not working, yeah. Right, yeah, because there's what the biggest disconnect is that what people don't understand is that these things that we're guided to do are not transactional in that you do them and then you get a return on your time investment. It is, those things are put in place to provide the structure for it to be transformational. So the transformational aspect of those behaviors and practices are to set the stage for you to then do this inner reflection work. And you know, throughout the Islamic tradition, throughout the Quran, throughout the Hadith, there's all kinds of guidance for us to take ourselves into account, right? So in the Quran, it says, Allah does not change a people until they change what is in themselves. And this is really the piece that's missing. What a lot of people do, this spiritual bypassing, is that they're doing, their focus is on doing and then not on being. You know, they're not really concerned with or even aware of the heart. And so they, you know, we're not taught to sort of identify with this as the locus of our being. And then we're also not taught to sort of take this time and space to go inward and reflect and take accountability. Even though this is all throughout the Quran, Allah says, you know, swears by nafs al-lawama, which is the state of the nafs when it's in a state of taking itself into account.
Yeah. So it feels like that's always been there, and somehow, you know, in modern life we're not taught that. We don't think about that anymore. And even the association that you set up, the International Association, is fairly young. I mean, it's what, 2 or 3 years old now, isn't it?
True. Right.
And your background is in fairly mainstream Western psychology. Is that right?
Yeah, so when I started, I would say that the association came to life about 3 years ago, but it had roots several years back. So my teacher, Malik Badri, has been doing this work for about more than 40 years. And it was really just trying to open the minds of really the Muslim world to this notions of Islam having an important role in the field of psychology. But then there has been a surge of interest in this in the past 3 years, which sort of pushed the rise for this association to finally come into fruition. But yeah, my background was actually in psychology. I did all of my training in mainstream contemporary psychology, and actually this was before I became Muslim. The way that I came into Islam was through psychology. So it's very interesting that, my perspective, oftentimes people are talking about this idea of sort of bringing Islam as a lens, or bringing psychology as a lens to look at Islam, or vice versa. Whereas for me, my whole introduction to Islam was, I was studying psychology, and I was always interested in the meaning of that word psychology, the study of the soul. And so I was looking for an actual spiritual framework for understanding the soul in a really deep way, of how the psycho-spiritual reality of the human being really to inform my clinical work. And it was in that research that I found that Islam has this ilm nafs, this science of the soul. And it was through that study, through the track of psychology, that I actually became to the place of embracing Islam.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to Abdullah's series he did with the Cambridge Muslim College called Ramadan. What was it called? Midnight Moments during this Ramadan. Absolutely brilliant, like short 10 to 15 minute pieces that you would do. And it was, I listened to the entire series of those little talks, found them absolutely brilliant and absolutely revelatory, actually, because it's not something I'd ever really considered. But when you hear it, you think, well, that just makes complete sense. So that just makes complete sense. So this whole idea of, presence, cultivating presence, contemplation, those kinds of things. But you have this bigger end of, well, why am I doing these things? It's not just for me. This is about my relationship with Allah. This is about my connection with Allah, which ultimately is what we're all striving to do. Right. So I would really encourage all of you to look that up. It's on I think it's still available on Cambridge Muslim College.
On the YouTube channel.
I think so.
YouTube channel, yeah.
Yeah. So if we bring it up to where we are today in these crazy times, so all the stuff that's been going on, the Ramadan like no other that we've all had, are you finding that there is an increase in mental health issues during this time?
Huge increase. I've been saying, like, I've never been so busy in my life, and I'm stuck at home with 3 children, and I have there's a lot of things that I'm not able to do, and yet there's a huge requests for talks on mental health, more counseling. And what I'm finding, just even in my practice of working in counseling with people, is that there is when the coronavirus happened, and people were not only stuck inside, but sort of this just increase of, well, I can't control my life, and everything seemed out of control. And what that did was it was a wake-up call for people that now, a lot of what I see people is thinking about the future, having anxiety about the future, having anxiety about things they can't control, right? Our locus of control has, and what I'm seeing is it's like, I see it as a wake-up call, because that was always the case. The case was that we always didn't have these, our futures in our control, but we had situated our life to where we can be comfortable, and that comfort really becomes avoidance, which then becomes another form of bypassing the work that we need to do on taking ourselves into account, right? And so I think 2 things, like the coronavirus hit, and that was, people are stuck at home. So I was seeing a lot of relationship issues. People are, whereas usually they have a life where they can get away from their family members, Now they're stuck with them, and now all that stuff comes up that they hadn't been dealing with. And so they hadn't been doing this maintenance work of mental health, which really is owning up to and looking at yourself. And so we tend to put blinders on and go with what's comfortable. And now you can't hide from it. It's sort of, you're forced to deal with these things. And then I would say also now with this, I see this Black Lives Matter sign behind you. I know your son made that, mashallah. But now, this is a huge issue now that is coming up globally. And what I'm seeing is that it brings up trauma. There's people need to deal with essentially mental health, or when we're talking about this holistic sort of Islamic perspective, it's about balance. It's about coming into balance. And balance is about paying attention to what you haven't been paying attention to. And so there's two tracks of that. Sometimes it's dealing with presenting problems as they come, sort of like having to deal with what's right in your face. And then there's maintenance. And when you're not doing the maintenance, you have less resilience to deal with the crises. But those same crises, let's say for the racism, sort of the cover of racism being pulled away, and people, this has been there all along, right? This is, in the US particularly, this is more than 400 years. But now people are forced to look at it, but then it's different for different people. And this is where balance comes in. So for Black Americans, dealing with this, it's intergenerational trauma. And so having to deal with that trauma, part of putting that into balance may need to be, pulling back a little bit, not being so engaged in the social media and everything, because there's self-care that needs to happen in order to heal this trauma individually, but also intergenerationally, right? But then that same issue for other people who haven't been paying attention to this, haven't had racism be in their face as a daily experience, part of their mental health and maintaining balance is having to actually lean in and maybe educate themselves and take more accountability for their own internal racism and the way that, these are diseases of the heart. And in Islamic psychology, this is sort of how we understand imbalance in the soul's anatomy. It is all coming into balance, and we talk about diseases of the heart and cures of the heart.
Somebody's saying there's an echo. I'm not sure where the echo is coming from.
Yeah, I'm hearing that too.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not echoing. So that the way of framing it as diseases of the heart, actually, that's quite a useful way of kind of picturing it as well, I think. And racism can just simply be boiled down to that. It's just simply wrong. It's amongst all those other things that we're doing, and the work that I think that you talk about in your Midnight Moment series as well is looking internally and trying to remove the layers that are covering your heart, and there's specific practical ways of doing that, right? I mean, in terms of what we're seeing as well, I mean, I'm seeing more of it as well. So the health, even just health anxiety, whether real or perceived, is just off the scale at the moment. And we've both got children, Abdallah. We were both talking about how we both worry about how we come out of this period of lockdown and how we can engender trust again in our children, and how the fear and anxiety that they're feeling, how we can move past that. It's huge. This has really, it's like a schism through society at the moment of how we move on.
Right.
Is that something you're finding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key is that we don't want to move past it. This is the problem, is that this is how pathology happens, whether it's individual or societal, is that when you don't deal with things and you don't allow the pathology or the illness or the disease to unfold and move through, then what happens is we cover it over, we push it away, and then we try to move on, and we avoid and we bypass, and this is exactly what has been happening on all these levels. And so what our call now is to move forward, not backward. Move forward with understanding that we need to be, as just people, we need to be more self-aware, more aware in general, and integrating this reflection, coming into taking ourselves into account, that needs to be integrated in our daily lives. Otherwise, what happens is we do go back, we do move on, and because what we're doing, we tend to, as human beings, we like it when things are more comfortable and when things are easier.
Yeah.
And so we sort of situate things around us so that we can be comfortable. But then what happens is we limit our growth. And growth really happens from, like I said, you have to first see the problem, then open it up so that, you have to move through it rather than around it. I would say we need to understand what do we need to be putting in place that we haven't been doing before, so that we can not sort of find ourselves in the same place once we all go back out and the coronavirus subsides, once people forget about George Floyd and these things, because this has been happening all the time, and then it fades. And so people want to get back to normal. And I think it's, we talk about politically, they say this, to stay woke, right? And it becomes this political thing. But I think about that in mental health terms. We need to literally, the word stay is really important there. And that staying woke means you don't do it once, you do it every day. You have to have a practice. You have to have the practice of awakening to your experience. And so, this is one of the things that, or the main thing that I was trying to do in this series of Midnight Moments that you watched, is really not talk so theoretical and abstract about these things, but really give people practical tools of how to stay self-aware and present. Uh-oh.
I got my voice back, yay. I think that was one of the main things that I found different from the kind of mainstream clinical psychology that we know about, which talks about self-care, well-being, looking after yourself, making yourself feel better, which oftentimes means what can I do to soothe myself and make myself feel better? I'm going to go to a spa, or I'm going to take some me time, or and again, it's like you say, you're bypassing the work bit that you actually need to do, which is look to the inward reflection bit. And it may not be comfortable, and it may not be very nice what you discover about yourself actually, but then, like you're saying, that's part of the work. It's sitting with that and working through it to make progress and have some kind of growth.
Yeah, and I think we need, not only do we need tools to do it, but we also need communal encouragement for this type of thing, right? So whether that means more programming and more access to services, but sort of a collective consciousness of that it's okay to be vulnerable, and that this is a desirable thing, and that we need to have open hearts so that we can do this work. But that needs to be grounded so we can stay resilient. And I would say, for some people and in some circumstances, the like you say, the self-care of sort of retreating and disconnecting, first of all, that's a privilege that some people don't have. Some people are just dealing with trauma constantly. The thing is, though, that this is why it's sort of, it's not the same remedy for every solution or every situation. So sometimes when people are experiencing trauma and even coming up against trying to work through trauma, you can't expect to constantly be looking at yourself, because that's going to just be too much to handle. There has to be a balance of opening up, looking at it, and then there is sort of that retreat is part of self-care to build resiliency so you can continue on doing the work. Whereas, like I said, for some people, that self-care becomes an insular thing where you're just avoiding and blocking the work. And so, it's having the awareness and ability to know which is right for which circumstance. But really, what needs to always be in place is, as human beings, we fluctuate. So in the Prophet ﷺ said that the heart, the human heart, is like a bubbling pot of water, and it's constantly fluctuating. And so this is just our natural state of human beings. And so we have to have things that create some balance and stability, and that is constancy, meaning you have to do things all the time to create this container so that you have this grounding of resiliency to then deal with these ups and downs, so that they don't throw you off every time. Every time something happens that's out of your control, you go plummeting down. Whereas if you have these things in place all the time, then those fluctuations can kind of not be so
extreme.
debilitating.
Yeah. I mean, so in terms of like the practical, really hard, just practical things that we could be doing, you know, do you have some kind of ideas that we could be implementing today even?
Yeah, you know, there's so many things, and it's holistic too. It's because you have to get every sector of, because we're integral beings, and so we can't just try to sort out our thoughts or, you know, just understand cognitively. We need to involve our physical bodies, and you know, what I find is that we're so disconnected. We become like these floating heads that are, you know, even right now, we're in this
we're
world
all floating heads.
we're all heads talking to each other and ideas, and we need to come back into our bodies and realize that our soul, our being, is this whole thing that is, the body is part of that. And so we need to, now that doesn't just mean physical health, but it means being sort of consciously aware of your awareness needs to be also in your body, not just here. And so that means sort of dropping down into the body, I would say. And so that's, you know, having a physical process of being connected to your body, but also orienting yourself more to this being the center of your being rather than here. And that means taking some time to come down. And so some of the practices that, so I would say there's so many things that help put us into balance that I would say from an Islamic perspective is about living a fitrah lifestyle. So fitrah meaning our natural disposition. And we have sort of a natural way of following the natural orders of the world by aligning with what is natural. And so a lot of, if you look at the lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ, that is our map for how to live this natural lifestyle, which can sort out a lot of that imbalance, so that then we're prepared to do the work internally. But I'd say the things that are missing the most in people's practice is, first of all, breathing. And it's not necessarily that you have to have some specific breathing exercise necessarily, but just that we've become so disconnected from breath that this is, you know, anxiety. When people have a panic attack, it's literally they're not breathing. And so your chest like caves in on itself. And this expanding of the chest is an expanding of your conscious awareness and presence here. The place where we breathe in our lungs is the same place where our heart center is. And so when we have a, you know, voluntary practice of breathing rather than this involuntary breathing that just barely keeps us alive, we increase our capacity and our ability to be in the present moment, which is really the only place where we have control of our lives, right? So, and what happens is we live either in the past or the future, and that's why we're either depressed or anxious. And so we need to constantly be bringing ourselves back into this present moment. And so that's breathing, but it's also having some sort of contemplative practice. So people are very familiar with, people talk about mindfulness and meditation, but I think for a lot of Muslims, they don't realize that there is an integral practice of this within Islam. And there's many versions of it, but one word is tafakkur, which basically means contemplation. And it's not just a thinking a contemplation. It's not just looking at God's creation and saying, wow, that's part of it, but then it's supposed to sort of bring that awareness into a place of being, in a place of calmness in the center, in the heart. And like you had mentioned before, the difference in like other practices of this is that it's not just about surrendering to the self or surrendering to this notion of being calm in the self, but that there's a notion of that's actually plugging back into a witnessing of God. And so this is what makes it fundamentally Islamic, is that there is a notion that the human being is a servant of God. And so it's you're surrendering to God, not just surrendering to the moment, not just surrendering to the self, but the self is actually surrendering to God. And that's where you open up to this original state of witnessing God, which is an experiential reality of being Muslim rather than this transactional thing. Because the word Islam is a state of being. You can be in a state of Islam. And so it's really not just doing, these external things, but cultivating an inner experience of being Muslim. I think you're muted.
I think it's getting back to that original state when we were all souls together. Originally, kind of preconceptually, we were all souls together. So, we spend our lives, we should be trying to, I think, and we would feel better for it, is trying to get back to that state of being a soul in the presence of Allah, like you said.
Right.
I mean, I think, so the breathing and the contemplative practice. So you talked about something before called Mahasabha.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about that?
This is really the core thing that would be the closest to what we need to do in terms of what we usually think of in terms of self-help or personal development and therapy. It's the self, right? It's looking at ourselves, increasing self-awareness. And so, this is like the Arabic word inkishaf is self-awareness. And our goal is to be more self-aware, because there's this notion that he who knows himself knows his Lord. And that by uncovering the heart, we have these coverings over our heart that keep us from witnessing. And so what the work really is, the ongoing work, is taking the self into account. And this is a practice. So Mahasabha is the word that means self-introspection. And really, there's all kinds of scholars that write about this all the way back to the time of the Sahaba. But particularly, somebody who's referenced a lot, Imam al-Ghazali from the 12th century, has a whole book in his Ihya al-Ulumuddin called Bab al-Tafakkur. And he talks about 5 sort of stages of this practice. But then also Mahasabha, so that he has a book on Mahasabha. So al-Ghazali as well as Muhasabi, who's named after the practice of Mahasabha, talk about what we're supposed to do is take ourselves into account. Ghazali talks about it as if like an accountant keep doing a bookkeeping at the end of each day. What did I do? Why did I react that way? What was my motivation for doing this? Why was this person so irritating to me today? And taking note of that. And Muhasabi talks about doing this practice of muhasabah on six things. So our hearing, our sight, our tongue, our feet, and our hands, and hearing. And because these are pathways to the heart. So these are basically how we take in our experience in the world. And we're using this awareness to be conscious of how is that affecting my heart, because that's when these diseases of the heart start to accumulate. And what we want to do is check them and look at them before they become, rust on our heart, or this sort of crust over our heart. And so this practice of Mahasabha, what I say, really this is something that you have integrated into your self-awareness, this is really staying woke, right? Having this awakened consciousness. But what I often recommend people do is to keep a Muhasabha journal. And this is similar to, recent self-help recommendations. They tell you to keep a journal or a gratitude journal. And this is something important because what it's doing is sort of holding yourself accountable to this process of accountability, right? It's tangible, and it's something that keeps you connected to this, that it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you do only in crisis. It's something that you constantly need to be engaged in. Yeah.
So that whole idea of hisab, which in Urdu we know that word, right? To take hisab, is literally to account, take account, to kind of count up. And I'm a sucker for a little notebook, so you know I'm all for notebooks and writing things down. But yeah, you're right. That whole idea of thinking through the day of exactly what irritated you and why, and how could you change that possibly. Yeah. And then the gratitude bit as well that you mentioned. Is that a separate piece of work?
Yeah, so gratitude, you know, there's a lot of talk in positive psychology about gratitude, and the idea is that, and they've done studies of this, a study of how the mind works, and you know, we're taken more by negative experiences. It's easier for us to focus on the negative, and so the recommendation is to spend time focusing on the positive. So picking things that you're grateful for, and what that does is it builds up tolerance, you know, and this isn't a new thing. This is something that is in the Quran itself, that, you know, the believer is supposed to, when something good happens, they have shukr, they have gratitude. And when a hardship befalls, then you have sabr. But so this is how it works, is that the first comes before the other. When good happens, you have shukr, meaning your thankfulness for those good things. You're reminding yourself of positivity. Oh, this positive thing happened. So then what it does is it builds up this awareness that there are positive things, so that when you experience the negative, our psychological makeup is that overshadows our experience. This is horrible. Why me? This is a calamity. You're with the trial. And so it's very hard to remember, and this is why Allah says, have sabr. But sabr is not an inactive patience, it is a persistence. And so the part of that sabr is then tapping back into when you had times of shukr. And so Al-Balkhi, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who was a scholar in the 12th century, no, 9th century, I believe, way before Martin Seligman, way before positive psychology. And he talked about that we need to store positive thoughts in our mind so that we can use them when things are not going well. And he likened this to a medicine cabinet. And so we literally use that metaphor of the storing of positive thoughts is a medicine cabinet that you go and you look, when an ailment comes, you go and you look in your medicine cabinet. Oh, I have this for this time. And so, you know, it's fascinating that these resources and these tools are not only from our early Muslim scholars, but directly from the Quran itself, guiding us to these things that now we think of as contemporary psychology.
No, I agree with you. It feels like we're discovering something new, and it's been there all along. And actually, I would probably say all this stuff, like you say, is fairly essential daily work. It's nothing, you know, that we shouldn't just wait till we're in that moment of trial to then look to it. So, you know, it's something that we should be doing all the time. And it's something we talked a bit about younger kids, didn't we? And how we, because my generation, certainly, we weren't taught this kind of thinking. We weren't taught to, you know, and even in my parents' generation, there was no talk about kind of well-being or knowledge of the soul. So how can we start inculcating that in our children?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think first and foremost, your children mimic what we do, right? And they also are sponges, and so whatever you're doing, they're going to pick that up, and then it's gonna even if it doesn't show now, it's going to show later. And so if we're anxious and we're worried, and you know, they're not only are they going to be affected by that anxiety, they're going to start to be like, oh, there must be something to be concerned about here, you know. And so part of it is doing our own work, right? You can't expect your kids to, you know, sort of point the finger at them. You got 3 pointing back at yourself, like, so we need to front load that by doing this work on ourselves. But then, so I have 3 kids. The oldest is 11, and she's pretty aware, but she's an 11-year-old, right? And so I wouldn't necessarily sit her down and tell her to do, you know, have these same practices of taking herself into account in a very specific way, or doing this contemplation practice. However, I am orienting her or all my kids towards these things by, when the thing comes up, reminding them like, hey, let's take account of ourselves today. So if she's experiencing anxiety, we'll do a Mahasabha practice, just like, hey, what happened today? What do you think happened today? Let's take a look. And usually I do this before bed. And then also my daughter tends to get anxiety, which is felt here. That's why I'm doing this. And she's sort of, she's worried. And so I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, well, you need to, sit and do a breathing practice and do tafakkur. But what I will do is I'll put my hand on her chest and I'll just breathe with her. So I'll literally make physical contact here, and and so she's just absorbing. There's this transmission of like, oh, wow, that feels different. My dad is being with me in this present moment. He's understanding what I'm going through, and he's, showing me, I'm showing her this practice of coming into presence to breathe. I haven't said anything. I'm not theoretically trying to make her understand psychology and her psychology, and because that's, she might not make the most sense to her.
Sorry. So that's really helpful, actually. Mashallah, I've got 5 children as well, and they're all at various ages of understanding. And it's like you say, it has to be age appropriate. But I'm really hopeful, actually, because I think with this generation, they are, even in schools and generally in society, there is more talk about well-being and meditation and that kind of practice generally. I mean, even my 7-year-old has a well-being week at school. I'm not sure what he got from it. I think he made a jar with glitter in it, and then they had a sleep in the hall on the floor. I think that was supposed to him meditating. But the language is starting to appear, which is brilliant, because the mental health crisis among children and adolescents is just off the scale, and has always been dealt with very badly. So that's really, really helpful. I think there's a fair few comments and questions. How do you feel about taking a few of those? Yeah. Would that be okay?
Happy to do that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So let's see. I think someone's made a comment. Someone's my sister, actually, in Birmingham, about judgmental remarks about your weaknesses from others, which taps into that feeling that you're not quite good enough. So there's someone has really helpfully posted the links to your Midnight Moments course as well. Someone's asked, for some, this me time is non-existent because it hasn't been a taught or model priority from childhood. So where do we start with that?
So I guess judgmental remarks about your weaknesses from others, just briefly, there's 2 aspects to that. One is like, we have way too much projection on others that we take in on ourselves, right? And there's a lot of lack of mercy and lack of love in general in humanity, obviously, because we see it, but also in the Muslim community, unfortunately. There's just there's this guilt and there's this hanging over, and right, oftentimes from our loved ones. And so that we need to understand what's not ours and what's other people's. And so some of that you can't take in because it's too negative, right? But in our practice of taking ourselves into account, we need to invite criticism, not only from ourselves, but from others. So Al-Ghazali talks about this great metaphor about how if we tend to keep friends around us that tell us that we're great and we're doing good and sort of always just on our side, because that's what we want. We want to stay comfortable. But at the same time, if we had a scorpion in our clothing, we would expect our companion to tell us the scorpion's there so we can get it out, right? So that we're not negatively effective. And so he's saying we need to have friends like this. We need to invite friends that are able to tell us our faults, show us our faults, so that we can then get it out, so that we can clean it out, and not to avoid that, not to look for people that just sort of keep us comfortable, but invite not criticism, but constructive criticism, really, right? And so that we can take account. So I would say that. And then finding time. What was the question? Finding time.
About how do you start with finding me time when it hasn't really ever been taught to you as a priority during your life?
Right. So the priority is, I mean, that's a family problem, that's a societal problem, that's a cultural problem that somehow that hasn't been thought of as a priority when it absolutely is. And so now, first of all, talking about kids, the best thing we can do is start to instill that for our kids, because they're the next generation. For ourselves, a lot of the work we need to do on our own work is almost reparenting ourselves, right? Finding a way to tap into the love and the mercy that we didn't get, which really we need to tap into that as a source from God. Allah is Ar-Rahman, Allah is Ar-Rahim, Allah is Al-Wadud. We need to let some of that in, but then we also need to prioritize the time that we need, because this is the foundation for being able to do all the other stuff that we say we don't have time for, right? I don't have time, I'm running around, I can't do all this stuff. If you were to prioritize being present, being self-aware, being connected, you're going to have more barakah in your time, to where you're suddenly able to manage things better because you're grounded and you're in this balanced place. Whereas the reason you're not able to manage juggling all these things up in the air and these balls is because you're barely even present with any one of them, and you're not at your best, so you can't manage. So it's realizing that this is a necessity, it's not a luxury. And then it's really about, I don't know if people are familiar with 7 Habits, but Stephen Covey's language of putting big rocks first, right? So we have to realize what those things are that are so important, and schedule those in first. Then the other little things that always come up sort of fit around them, and that's the best way. So for me, especially in lockdown, 3 kids, my wife and I are still trying to both work. We have kids that have special needs for their schooling. We have to, so time is not on my side. I find my times, I wake up in the middle of the night and I do this practice of Qiyam al-Layl, which is a practice that the Prophet ﷺ did. And so this is, there are ways to find that time if you prioritize them.
Absolutely. I think that's the game changer, isn't it? It's seeing it as essential work. It's like my friend is a psychotherapist, always says, if the plane crash, the oxygen masks fall down, you're going to put yours on before you put your family members on. And the idea about the negative comment, she always frames as a muddy ball. Someone's throwing their muddy ball at you because it's their stuff. So just don't catch the muddy ball, right? Yeah. Someone here has made a comment, Dangos, I don't know who this is, say something about the soulless fitrah and the distinction between nafs and ruh.
Okay, so it's hard to talk about this in a brief way because it's very complex. I do have this is what my research focuses on, and I have several research papers that break this down, and I created a model to sort of visualize a diagram of the Islamic model of the soul. But to answer this question of the fitrah and the distinction between nafs and ruh, so our fitrah of our soul is, like you said, to be in a place of knowing that God is our Lord, knowing that everything is interconnected, and that we come from God. So in this place, before the souls came into this life, Alastu bi rabbikum. Allah said, Alastu bi rabbikum, and we said, Bala shahidna. Am I not your Lord? Surely we witness. Not we testify, which is often translated as, but we witness. And so the fitrah, the natural disposition of our being, of our identity as souls, is to know that we are dependent on God. But then, and that is contained in our ruh. So when we came into this world, we were veiled from that reality, and we got a nafs. Our nafs is this self that we identify with, that feels that our experience is separate. And so our self-directedness, our notion of me as an individual being. But meanwhile, inside of us and our soul, we also have the ruh, which we know that Allah breathed into us. And what this represents is this pure, uncorrupted aspect that still knows, right? So there's this part of us that knows and has access to that witnessing. And the nafs sort of covers over that truth. And so what our job is to do, we talk about the jihad nafs, the struggle of the soul, or there's the word tazkiyat nafs, which is the purification of the self. And what that is, it's covering over this sort of our true nature of being witnessing has been occluded or covered over from our experiences of being human in the dunya, which is why it's very important distinction that when we talk about natural, it is natural for our nafs to forget and to be in a state of ghafla, of forgetfulness. And so this is where we have to reframe the understanding of like sin or beating ourselves up for being bad because we're not doing things right. This is the word for human being, insan, is also the root for forgetfulness. We're set up to forget, and so we have to come back and just constantly remember. And so, I would say when we're talking about fitrah, the fitrah of our ruh is to be in witnessing of Allah. The fitrah of our nafs is to forget. And so, but we're not damned by that scenario. There is there's an endless opportunity for coming back to this ruh through the practice of remembrance.
And that, like we talked about, is through all these kind of really practical ways of doing it, but also through prayer. Even the physical act of prayer, you're being physically present in your body, which is part of being present in that moment too. And also, I don't know whether there's any comment you could make about being in nature, and whether there is something about being outdoors and in nature that speaks to the ruh and the fitrah.
Yeah. So even when tafakkur is mentioned in the Quran, it's talked about contemplating on the natural world, the cycles of the star, the night and the day, and the stars, and we're oriented often to nature and to witnessing the tawheed or the oneness in nature, and sort of saying, subhanallah, look at this, look at what Allah has done. But there is a reality of Islam really embraces and incorporates nature in ibadah. The practice of contemplation has been practiced by the Prophet ﷺ. Used to go into nature, out away from the community, to go into the cave for each month for a long period of time, for quite a long period of time, and it was disconnecting from the busyness, from the dunya, and being in a natural environment allows you to access this really natural nature of our soul. And so there is a connection between nature and our fitrah. And so when you look at Islamic medicine, even a lot of the remedies are natural remedies, or all of them really, when you look at really deep into Islamic medicine, and that there's this, by aligning with natural processes and experiencing nature, we actually in turn come back into our own nature, which then brings ourselves and our beings and our souls into alignment of our true nature, which is really what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, because I've always found that when I'm out in nature, that's when I can feel most spiritual, way more than being in a mosque praying. I prefer to be outdoors, and just that and that's good to hear that that's kind of validated through the deen, and that's what I think we all find if we all come to this, is that actually there's so much stuff which is our deen is so rich in this for us. It has the answers there, and we've kind of become disconnected from it all. So I mean, I don't know whether, Abdallah, you'd be welcome to open to people contacting you, or through the association.
Yeah, I'm happy to have people contact me, to stay in contact with people. I do lots of different things, but the best place to find out, sort of to contact me, but then also to sort of find out what I'm doing, I'll put it here in the comments. It's my website, Shifa Counseling.
Nuzhat, if I may just add to this, this has been an fascinating session. Thank you so much. Just to
Yeah.
add a little bit about, just to put a bit of a plug about Concordia here, but a group of us Concordians have been talking for a while about how there isn't a sort of Islamic framework that exists on the whole issue of well-being. And it's one of the reasons that we set up this Sukoon retreat, to start exploring these frameworks and start, it's not getting enough traction. So I'm very pleased that you're doing this work, and this was an absolutely enlightening session. I hand you over to close it up before I introduce.
Thanks, Mudassar. I just wanted to point out about that if anyone is listening to this and feels that actually they would like some help with this work, you know, with the help of a psychologist, and a kind of accredited Islamic psychologist, there are some around, aren't there?
Yeah. So specifically, you know, there's a lot of people doing more training in this area, but specifically in the UK, there's a clinic in Bradford called Ihsan that does offer from this model, working from an Islamic model, and they have sort of a multidisciplinary treatment team, which is fantastic. So people with different areas of specialty as counselors, but then also they have a hakim, and a psychiatrist, and so this is great. And then in the US, there's Khalil Center, which has a hub in Chicago, but also in the Bay Area and in New York, I believe now. And so you can look these things up, Khalil Center.
That's great.
And then I've put also the website islamicspsychology.org. This is the association, but there's also a lot of resources there for people to find out more.
That's great. That's been absolutely, I mean, just brilliant to listen, and really, really helpful on a really practical level. I would even say anybody listening to this who is from a kind of psychology background who would ever think of training in this, we need more practitioners of this, really. You know, it should be me as a GP. If I come across a Muslim patient who's having struggles and is requesting this, I should be able to refer people and know who I can refer to. So if anybody is looking for another string to their bow in any kind of way, please look into it. I think Cambridge Muslim College do an accreditation process, don't they?
Yeah, so we have the association, we do these certifications. The first one is kind of open to everyone who's interested, and then it gets more into clinical for the second and beyond. But yeah, we've been running those at Cambridge Muslim College, and inshallah we'll be doing more in person once we're able to do those things again in person.
Inshallah. Well, thank you so much, Abdullah. That's been absolutely brilliant. I'm sure everyone's really benefited from it. And I'm going to hand back to Zahid now. So alaikum assalam from me, and I'm going to hand back to Zahid now for the next session.
All right, assalamu alaikum. Thanks so much.
Alaikum, guys. Thank you so much, Nuzhats and Abdallah. Really, really honored to have you with us. I'm going to hand it over to Mudassar now, who's going to lead the next session. We're very, very honored to have a member of parliament with us today. I'm going to hand it over to Mudassar.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Zahid. Thank you, Nuzhat, and thank you, Abdullah. Fascinating start to our distant socializing session here. We've really, I know that many of us really enjoyed this session, and hopefully we'll have you on more often. For those of you that have just dialed in, you're listening to the 14th Concordia Forum Distant Socializing Under Lockdown session. We have been running these every single week during the lockdown, and now we've just begun doing them once a month. And to this particular session now, it is my great honor to introduce two very distinguished individuals who will be taking us through a wonderful conversation. We are very, very lucky to have as our chief guest for the next hour, Annalise Dodds, who is the Shadow Chancellor and Cabinet Minister with the UK Labour Party here in Britain. And moderating session with Annalise is going to be ITV's political reporter, and I recently